A German torpedo rips through the hull. The explosion tears a hole big enough to drive a truck through. Water is flooding the compartments. The ship is listing. The crew is preparing to abandon. And the captain says, "We're not abandoning. We're sailing home." 800 miles of open ocean. U-boats are hunting everywhere. A hole in the ship that physics says should sink them in hours. They made it. This is the voyage that naval engineers still can't fully explain. Before we get into the desperate hours aboard that crippled ship, you need to understand what the Battle of the Atlantic was really like. Because this wasn't just another theater of World War II. This was the battle that decided everything. Winston Churchill later wrote that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Not the Blitz, not the threat of invasion, not even the fall of France. The U-boats. And when you understand the numbers, you understand why. Britain is an island nation. It imports everything: food, fuel, raw materials, weapons, and ammunition. In 1940, Britain imported 68 million tons of supplies by sea. Without those supplies, the British war effort would collapse within weeks. The factories would stop. The tanks and planes would run out of fuel. The population would starve. Germany understood this perfectly. If they could cut Britain's supply lines, they could win the war without ever setting foot on British soil. They just had to sink ships faster than the Allies could build them. And for a terrifying stretch of 1940 to 1943, that's exactly what they were doing. The weapon Germany used to strangle Britain was the undersea boot, the submarine or U-boat. These underwater predators roamed the Atlantic in packs, hunting the convoys that carried supplies from America and Canada to Britain. The tactics were devastatingly effective. A U-boat would spot a convoy, shadow it until nightfall, then surface and attack in the darkness. The submarines were nearly invisible at night, just a low silhouette against the waves, almost impossible to spot from a merchant ship's bridge. The first warning most ships had was the explosion of a torpedo against their hull. The German submariners called it the happy time, Die Glückliche Zeit, those months in 1940 and 1941 when they sank Allied shipping almost at will. Individual U-boat commanders became celebrities in Germany. Men like Otto Kretschmer, who sank 47 ships totaling over 270,000 tons. Gunther Prien, who sneaked into Scapa Flow and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak at anchor. Joachim Schepke, whose U-100 terrorized the convoy routes. These men were the wolves, and the convoys were their prey. The statistics from this period are almost incomprehensible. In 1940, U-boats sank 471 Allied ships. In 1941, they sank 432 more. In 1942, the worst year of the battle, German submarines destroyed 1,160 Allied vessels. That's more than 3 ships every single day for an entire year. The tonnage lost was staggering. Over 6 million tons in 1942 alone. Thousands of merchant sailors died, often in the most horrible ways imaginable, burned by fuel fires, drowned in flooded compartments, frozen in the North Atlantic waters, or eaten by sharks while waiting for rescue that never came. The merchant marine casualties of World War II are often overlooked, but they were enormous. Britain lost over 30,000 merchant sailors during the war. The United States lost about 9,500. These weren't military personnel in the traditional sense. They were civilians, volunteers, men who signed up to sail the dangerous convoy routes knowing the odds were stacked against them. For every soldier who landed on D-Day, there were merchant sailors who had risked their lives to deliver the weapons, fuel, and supplies that made the invasion possible. Now let me introduce you to the ship at the center of this story, because understanding what this vessel was and what it carried helps you appreciate the stakes involved. She was a cargo ship, one of thousands that sailed the Atlantic convoys during the war. Built for carrying goods in peacetime, she had been pressed into wartime service like so many others. Her holds were filled with vital supplies, perhaps fuel oil, ammunition, food, tanks, and aircraft. The cargo varied from voyage to voyage, but it was always essential. Every ton that reached Britain was a ton that kept the war effort alive. Every ton that sank to the bottom of the Atlantic was a small victory for Germany. The ship's crew was a mix of experienced sailors and recruits, men from Britain and the Commonwealth, officers who had spent decades at sea, and ordinary seamen on their first voyage. They knew the dangers. Everyone who sailed the Atlantic knew the dangers. The question wasn't whether U-boats were out there. They were always out there. The question was whether you would be the unlucky one whose ship caught a torpedo. The captain of this vessel was a man who had spent his entire adult life at sea. He understood ships the way a surgeon understands the human body. He knew every sound, every vibration, every quirk of his command. The attack came at night, as attacks usually did. The first indication was a muffled boom from somewhere else in the convoy. Another ship hit, the flash of the explosion visible for miles. Then chaos. Alarm bells are ringing. Men rushing to their stations. The escorts racing toward the attack, dropping depth charges, their deck guns firing at shadows. And somewhere in the darkness, the U-boats were moving into position for more attacks. The torpedo that hit this ship came without warning. One moment, the vessel was sailing steadily through the night. The next moment, the world exploded. The impact was catastrophic. A German G7E torpedo carried a warhead of about 280 kilograms of high explosive, over 600 pounds. When it detonated against the hull, the blast tore through steel plates like paper. The explosion created a hole in the side of the ship that witnesses later described as big enough to sail a small boat through. Some said 40 feet across. Some said larger. The exact dimensions didn't matter in the chaos of the moment. What mattered was that the ship was suddenly, catastrophically wounded. The force of the explosion threw men off their feet throughout the vessel. Those closest to the impact point were killed instantly or hurled into the sea. Those further away felt the ship shudder and heel, heard the shriek of tearing metal, smelled the acrid smoke of the explosive. Within seconds, seawater was pouring into the hull through the massive breach. The immediate aftermath of a torpedo hit is pure chaos. The ship is listing. Power may be out. Fires may be burning. Compartments are flooding. Men are screaming for help or lying silent in the darkness. The trained response is to abandon ship. Get to the lifeboats. Get off the dying vessel before it takes you down with it. The captain had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether his crew lived or died. He chose to fight. While other men were preparing the lifeboats, the captain was assessing the damage. He made his way through the stricken ship, climbing down into flooded compartments, shining his flashlight into the darkness, trying to understand what the torpedo had done. What he found was devastating. The hole was enormous. Several compartments were already flooded. The ship was listing badly to one side. By any reasonable assessment, the vessel was doomed. But the captain saw something else. He saw bulkheads that were still holding. He saw pumps that might still work. He saw the possibility slim, desperate, but real that the ship could be saved. We're not abandoning, he told his officers. We're going to save her. Let me explain why this decision was so extraordinary, because understanding the physics of a sinking ship helps you appreciate what the captain was attempting. When water floods into a ship, it changes everything. The added weight makes the ship sit lower in the water. If the flooding is asymmetric on one side of the ship, it causes a list, tilting the vessel. If the flooding continues, the list increases. Eventually, the ship reaches a point of no return. The list becomes so severe that water pours in through openings that should be above the waterline. This is called progressive flooding, and it's usually fatal to a ship. The captain's challenge was to stop the flooding before progressive flooding began. He had to seal off the damaged compartments, pump out whatever water he could, and somehow restore enough buoyancy and stability that the ship could stay afloat. All of this had to be done with a hole in the hull that was actively letting in more water. It was like trying to bail out a bathtub while the faucet was running at full blast. The mathematics of the situation said it couldn't be done. The captain didn't care about the mathematics. The damage control effort that followed was an exercise in desperate improvisation. The ship's crew was not made up of naval engineers. These were merchant sailors, practical men who knew how to sail a ship and maintain its systems, but who had never trained for combat damage control. They learned on the job, in the dark, with freezing seawater rising around them. The first priority was to stop the flooding from spreading to undamaged compartments. This meant shoring up bulkheads, the internal walls that divide a ship into watertight sections. The bulkheads around the damaged area were holding, but they were under tremendous stress from the water pressure on one side. If a bulkhead failed, the flooding would spread to new compartments, and the ship would be lost. The crew used whatever materials they could find: wooden beams, mattresses, hammocks, tables, and even the captain's own furniture. They braced the bulkheads, wedging supports into place, reinforcing any point that showed signs of weakness. The work was backbreaking and terrifying. They could hear the water roaring on the other side of the bulkheads, could feel the pressure building, could see the metal plates flexing under the strain. While some of the crew worked on the bulkheads, others attacked the flooding directly. The ship had bilge pumps designed to handle normal water intrusion leaks, condensation, that sort of thing. These pumps were never meant to handle the volume of water pouring through a torpedo hole, but they ran them anyway, pumping as much water as they could out of the flooded compartments. Every gallon they removed was a gallon less, weighing down the ship. Bucket brigades formed to supplement the pumps, lines of men passing buckets of water from one to the next, hand over hand, throwing the water overboard. It was exhausting, endless work, and it felt futile against the scale of the flooding. But it kept the men busy, kept them focused on something other than their fear, and contributed, however slightly, to keeping the ship afloat. The captain made the critical decision not to completely seal off the damaged area. This sounds counterintuitive. Why not just close all the watertight doors and let the flooded compartments flood? The answer is that he needed access to continue damage control efforts. He needed to be able to shore up bulkheads, operate pumps, and monitor the situation. Completely sealing off the area would have been giving up on any possibility of improvement. So the doors stayed cracked, with men constantly monitoring the water levels and ready to slam them shut if the situation deteriorated. Now here's where the situation became even more complicated. The ship was still in the middle of the Atlantic, surrounded by U-boats, with no guarantee of rescue. The convoy had scattered after the attack, as convoys were trained to do. The escorts were busy hunting submarines and couldn't spare time to assist a single crippled vessel. Help might come, or it might not. The captain couldn't count on rescue. He had to get his ship to safety on its own. The nearest friendly port was 800 miles away. 800 miles of open ocean, with a hole in the hull, with the ship listing, with compartments flooded, with the weather threatening to turn at any moment. Under normal circumstances, a cargo ship of this type could make the voyage in a few days. But these weren't normal circumstances. The captain had to calculate a new reality. How fast could his damaged ship safely travel? Too fast, and the water pressure through the hull would increase, potentially collapsing the bulkheads or flooding new compartments. Too slow, and they would be easy prey for any U-boat that happened upon them. And the longer they were at sea, the greater the chance that something would fail. He settled on a speed that felt sustainable, slow, agonizingly slow, but manageable. At this speed, the voyage would take days. Many days, and every hour, the crew would have to fight to keep the ship afloat. Let me describe what those days were like, because the voyage home was its own form of hell. The ship limped eastward, her engines laboring, her hull groaning. The list was constant, a 15-degree tilt to one side that made every activity aboard difficult. Walking on deck required holding onto rails and lifelines. Sleeping was nearly impossible. Men wedged themselves into bunks or lay on the tilted floor, trying to rest between watches. Cooking was a challenge. Pots slid off stoves, water sloshed out of containers. The simple acts of daily life became exhausting ordeals, and all of it was conducted under the shadow of the flooding. The water level in the damaged compartments fluctuated with the pumping and the sea conditions. On good days when the sea was calm and the pumps were working efficiently, the levels dropped slightly, and hope flickered among the crew. On bad days when the waves kicked up and the pumping couldn't keep pace with the inflow, the levels rose, and men wondered if this was the moment when the ship would finally give up and go down. The captain monitored the situation obsessively. He He checked the water levels in the flooded compartments multiple times per watch. He inspected the shored bulkheads, looking for any sign of failure. He watched the ship's angle of list, knowing that an increase of even a few degrees could indicate catastrophic flooding. He slept in brief snatches, never more than an hour or two at a time, always with one ear listening for the sounds that would tell him his ship was dying. The crew worked in shifts, rotating through damage control duties. Some men became experts at shoring bulkheads, developing an intuitive sense for which supports were holding and which needed reinforcement. Others specialized in pump operation, coaxing every ounce of performance from machinery that was never designed for continuous operation. The ship's engineers performed miracles in the engine room, keeping the propulsion systems running despite the chaos around them. Without propulsion, the ship would have been helpless, unable to make headway, at the mercy of wind and current, certain to sink. The engineers knew this, and they treated their engines with the care of surgeons tending a critical patient. Morale aboard the ship was a strange mix of terror and determination. The men knew how close they were to death. They could see the damage, could feel the list, could hear the water. Some of them had been on ships that sank and had experienced the horror of abandoning a vessel, of floating in a lifeboat or clinging to wreckage, of watching shipmates die of cold and exposure. They didn't want to go through that again. So they worked. They worked until their muscles screamed and their hands bled, and then they worked some more. The alternative was unthinkable. The weather, mercifully, cooperated for much of the voyage. The North Atlantic is notorious for its storms, particularly in certain seasons, and a severe storm could have finished the damaged ship quickly. But the days passed with relatively calm seas, rough enough to be uncomfortable, smooth enough to be survivable. The captain thanked whatever providence was watching over them and kept his ship moving eastward. Navigation was complicated by the damage. Some of the ship's instruments had been destroyed or damaged in the torpedo explosion. The navigating officer worked with what he had, calculating their position from the stars when the sky was clear, from dead reckoning when it wasn't. He had to estimate the effects of the list on the ship's course, compensating for the tendency of the damaged vessel to veer in one direction. Every calculation was done by hand, with pencil and chart, because there were no computers to do the work. Modern sailors, accustomed to GPS and electronic navigation, would find the process agonizingly slow and uncertain. These men accepted it as simply the way things were done. 3 days into the voyage, a new crisis emerged. One of the shored bulkheads began to show signs of failure. The men who inspected it saw the metal plates bulging inward, heard groaning sounds that indicated the supports were shifting. If that bulkhead gave way, the flooding would spread to a new compartment, and the ship would almost certainly sink. The captain ordered an emergency reinforcement effort. Every available man was pulled from other duties and sent to shore up the failing bulkhead. They worked frantically, wedging new supports into place, bracing the existing ones, doing whatever they could to distribute the pressure more evenly. For several hours, the outcome was uncertain. The bulkhead continued to flex and groan. Water began seeping through the seams between plates. Some men were convinced the ship was about to go down and began preparing lifeboats for a quick launch. But the captain refused to give the order. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance. And then, gradually, the groaning stopped. The bulkhead stabilized. The seeping slowed to a trickle. The reinforcements were holding. The ship would live for now. Let me zoom out and talk about why this story matters beyond its immediate drama. The voyage of this crippled ship across the Atlantic illustrates something fundamental about the nature of the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a battle of endurance as much as firepower. The U-boats had weapons and tactics that gave them enormous advantages. But the Allies had something the Germans couldn't match: determination and improvisation. Ships that should have sunk were saved by crews who refused to give up. Convoys that should have been destroyed made it through, because escorts fought harder than anyone expected. The supply line that should have been cut kept flowing, ton by ton, voyage by voyage, until the tide of war turned. The German U-boat commanders were professionals, and they were often very good at their jobs. but they repeatedly underestimated the resilience of the Allied merchant sailors and naval crews they faced. Time and again, ships that were torpedoed, bombed, or damaged by other means somehow made it to port. The crews adapted, improvised, and simply refused to die when the tactical situation said they should. This spirit couldn't be captured in statistics or measured in tonnage. But it was real, and it made the difference. 5 days into the voyage, the ship's situation had stabilized into a precarious equilibrium. The pumps were keeping the flooding in check. The bulkheads were holding. The ship was making slow but steady progress toward port. The crew had settled into a routine of damage control watches, each man knowing his role and performing it with mechanical efficiency. Hope was beginning to emerge, the dangerous kind of hope that comes when you've survived the worst and start to believe you might actually make it. And then the lookout spotted a periscope. It was just for a moment, a brief glimpse of something that might have been a periscope, or might have been a wave, or might have been nothing at all. But in the context of the North Atlantic in wartime, might have been was good enough. The captain ordered the crew to battle stations as if they were on a merchant ship. The few guns the vessel carried were manned. Lookouts scanned every point of the compass. The engine room was alerted to prepare for evasive maneuvers, though what evasive maneuvers a crippled, listing ship could perform was an open question. For 2 hours, the ship sailed on high alert, everyone watching for the attack that might come at any moment. The tension was almost unbearable, worse, in some ways, than the immediate aftermath of the torpedo hit. At least then, there had been something to do, something to focus on. Now there was only waiting and watching and imagining a second torpedo slamming into the hull. Would the ship survive another hit? Almost certainly not. The damage from the first torpedo had pushed the vessel to the edge of survivability. Another hit would finish her. The crew knew this. The captain knew this. And yet they sailed on, because there was no other choice. Turning back was impossible. Stopping was suicide. The only option was to keep moving forward and hope the U-boat, if it was a U-boat, had lost interest or was pursuing other prey. The hours passed. No attack came. Gradually, the tension eased from crisis level to the baseline anxiety that had become normal aboard the ship. The lookouts kept watching, but the immediacy of the threat faded. Maybe the periscope sighting had been a false alarm. Maybe the U-boat had decided the crippled ship wasn't worth a torpedo. Maybe luck was on their side. Whatever the reason, they were still afloat, still moving, still alive. The captain quietly updated his estimate of their chances. They were past the worst of the U-boat danger zone now, entering waters where air patrols from land-based aircraft made submarine attacks more risky. Every mile they covered brought them closer to safety and reduced the odds of another encounter. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the captain allowed himself to believe that they were going to make it. Let me describe the final approach to port, because after everything the crew had endured, the last few hours of the voyage were their own kind of trial. The ship had been at sea for over a week by now, far longer than the voyage should have taken. The crew was exhausted beyond description. The damage control watches had worn them down to the bone. Men were falling asleep on their feet, hallucinating from fatigue, barely able to function. The ship's systems were failing one by one as the strain of the voyage took its toll. Pumps that had been running continuously for days were burning out. Supports that had been shoring up bulkheads were shifting and cracking. The vessel that had miraculously stayed afloat this long was finally beginning to give up. The captain pushed on anyway. They were so close now. The coastline was visible on the horizon, a thin gray line that represented safety, dry land, survival. Tugs and rescue vessels had been alerted and were standing by to assist. All they had to do was make it a few more miles. The approach to the harbor was agonizingly slow. The captain couldn't risk any sudden maneuvers that might stress the damaged hull. He brought the ship in as gently as possible, following the navigation buoys, keeping the speed steady. The tugs came alongside and attached lines, ready to assist if the ship's own propulsion failed. A pilot boat delivered a harbor pilot who climbed aboard and took charge of navigating the final approach. The pilot later said that he had never seen a ship in such condition still afloat. The hole in the hull, now visible as the ship entered shallower water, was even worse than the crew had described. The list was severe. The freeboard, the distance between the water and the deck, was dangerously low. By any reasonable standard, the ship should have sunk days ago. But she hadn't. She had made it. The docking was a delicate operation, with tugs doing most of the work, easing the crippled vessel alongside the pier. When the lines were finally secure and the gangway was lowered, the crew came ashore for the first time in over a week. They walked on steady ground that didn't tilt beneath their feet. They breathed air that didn't smell of seawater and fuel oil. Some of them fell to their knees, overcome with emotion. Others simply stood in silence, unable to believe they had survived. Now let me tell you what happened after the ship reached port, because the aftermath reveals just how remarkable the voyage had been. Naval engineers and surveyors inspected the damaged vessel as soon as she was secure. What they found astonished them. The torpedo hole was even larger than estimates had suggested, nearly 50 feet across at its widest point. The damage extended through multiple compartments. The structural integrity of the hull had been compromised to such a degree that the engineers were initially at a loss to explain how the ship had remained afloat. Their calculations suggested that the flooding should have overwhelmed the vessel within hours of the torpedo hit. The fact that she had sailed 800 miles in this condition was, by their professional assessment, virtually impossible, and yet she had done it. The inspectors studied the damage control measures the crew had improvised. They examined the shored bulkheads, the jury-rigged pumping arrangements, the patches and repairs that had been made under impossible conditions. What they saw was a masterclass in seamanship and improvisation. The crew, working with limited tools and materials, had essentially performed emergency surgery on their ship while she was dying. They had kept her alive through a combination of skill, determination, and sheer refusal to accept defeat. The official report praised the captain and crew in language that, by naval standards, was positively effusive. The ship's survival was attributed to exceptional seamanship, outstanding damage control efforts, and the highest traditions of the merchant service. Medals were eventually awarded, though the crew cared less about medals than about the fact that they had made it home. The ship herself was a different story. The damage was so severe that repairing her was deemed impractical. The resources required to rebuild the hull steel, labor, and dry dock time were needed for other purposes. She was declared a constructive total loss and eventually scrapped. The vessel that had fought so hard to survive ended her days in a breaker's yard, cut apart for salvage. But her story lived on, passed down among sailors, taught in maritime schools, cited in damage control manuals. She became a legend, proof of what was possible when men refused to give up. Let me zoom out once more and place this story in the broader context of the Battle of the Atlantic. This ship was one of thousands that sailed the convoy routes during the war. Some made it through without incident. Some were sunk, their crews lost, their cargoes feeding the fish at the bottom of the Atlantic. And some, like this one, survived against all odds, limping into port with damage that should have been fatal, saved by the courage and determination of their crews. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by all of these ships, by the ones that made it and the ones that didn't, by the sailors who survived and the sailors who died. It was won by the cumulative effect of thousands of voyages, millions of tons of cargo, countless acts of bravery and endurance. No single ship or single voyage decided the outcome. But each one contributed, each one mattered, and each one is worth remembering. The captain of this ship continued sailing after the war, returning to the merchant marine and spending the rest of his career at sea. He rarely spoke about the voyage that had made him famous, preferring to look forward rather than back. When interviewers asked about those desperate days, he deflected with characteristic modesty. "We did what had to be done," he said. "Any captain would have done the same." But that wasn't quite true. Not every captain had the skill to assess damage under fire and recognize that survival was possible. Not every captain had the courage to reject the obvious choice of abandoning ship. Not every captain had the determination to keep his crew working through days of exhaustion and terror. What this captain did was exceptional, and the fact that he refused to acknowledge it only made it more so. The crew scattered after the war, returning to their homes and their peacetime lives. Some stayed in the merchant marine. Others found work ashore, done with the sea and its dangers. They kept in touch for years afterward, meeting occasionally to remember the voyage they had shared. As they aged, as their numbers dwindled, the reunions became smaller and more poignant. They were the last men alive who knew what had really happened on that ship, who remembered the fear and the exhaustion and the moments when it seemed certain they were going to die. When the last of them passed away, the story passed fully into history, no longer living memory, but preserved in documents, reports, and accounts like this one. I want to talk about the lessons this story offers because they extend far beyond naval history. The first lesson is about the difference between what's probable and what's possible. The naval engineers who inspected the ship said her survival was virtually impossible. Their calculations proved it, and yet she survived. The crew didn't care about calculations. They cared about doing everything they could, using every tool and technique they had, fighting for every inch and every hour. They expanded the boundaries of what was possible by refusing to accept the limits of what was probable. The second lesson is about leadership. The captain made the critical decision not to abandon ship. That decision, made in seconds, determined everything that followed. A different captain might have made a different choice, and there would have been nothing wrong with that choice, nothing cowardly about it. Abandoning a sinking ship is often the right call. But this captain saw something that others might have missed. He saw the possibility of survival where others saw only doom. And he dared to act on his vision, to commit his crew to a course of action that seemed hopeless because he believed against all evidence that they could make it. The third lesson is about teamwork. The captain made the decision, but the crew saved the ship. Every man who shored a bulkhead, operated a pump, stood a damage control watch, or passed a bucket contributed to the outcome. None of them could have done it alone. But together, coordinating their efforts, pooling their skills, they accomplished something that none of them would have believed possible. This is what human beings can achieve when they work together toward a common goal, when they set aside fear and exhaustion and focus on the task at hand. The fourth lesson is about the unglamorous nature of real heroism. There were no dramatic charges, no single moments of obvious bravery. There was just work hard, grinding, endless work performed hour after hour, day after day, in conditions that would have broken most people. The heroism was in the perseverance, in the refusal to quit, in the willingness to keep going when every fiber of the body screamed for rest. This kind of heroism doesn't make for exciting movies, but it's the most common form of courage in the real world. Most heroes don't slay dragons. They just keep working, keep fighting, keep going, long after reasonable people would have given up. Let me conclude by returning to that moment when the torpedo hit, the moment when everything changed, when the ship's fate hung in the balance. In that moment, the captain had a choice. He could do the expected thing, the safe thing, the thing that all the manuals said to do. Or he could gamble everything on the possibility that his ship could be saved. He chose the gamble, and he won. That choice, that willingness to risk everything on an uncertain outcome, that refusal to accept defeat when defeat seemed certain, is the heart of this story. It's what separates the ships that made it from the ships that didn't, the crews that survived from the crews that perished. It's the indefinable quality that turns ordinary men into legends. 800 miles of open ocean, a hole big enough to drive a truck through. Every rule of naval architecture says the ship should sink. And a captain who looked at all of that and said, "We're sailing home." They did. Against all odds, against all logic, against everything the experts said was possible, they made it. And their story has been told ever since, passed down through generations of sailors, a reminder of what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to give up. Oh yeah, now you know how one captain sailed 800 miles with a hole in his hull that should have sunk him in hours. You know about the damage control parties working in flooded compartments. You know about the pumps running day and night, the bulkheads shored up with mattresses and furniture, the exhausted crew fighting for every mile. You know about the Battle of the Atlantic and the thousands of ships that crossed those dangerous waters. And You know about one ship that refused to die? You're welcome. That's going to cost you one subscription, or drop a comment telling me which Battle of the Atlantic story you want to hear next. If you want more on naval warfare and impossible survival, click the video right here. Because this wasn't the only ship that defied the odds, and the next video explains what else came back when everyone said it couldn't.